There is a moment in almost every empath's life when they begin to question whether their sensitivity is a gift or a burden. They look back at years of giving, forgiving, understanding, and carrying the emotional weight of people who often never stopped to ask how they were doing. They remember the relationships where they became the therapist instead of the partner, the friend who always listened but was rarely heard, the family member expected to remain strong while everyone else was allowed to fall apart. Over time, a dangerous story begins to form. It whispers that perhaps they are simply destined to suffer because they care too much. But that story is not true. What many people mistake for punishment is often preparation. The experiences that seem unfair while you're living through them frequently become the very experiences that shape the person you eventually become. Pain has an extraordinary way of reorganizing our priorities. It strips away illusions. It forces questions we would never ask during comfortable seasons. And while no one would willingly choose heartbreak or betrayal, those moments often reveal truths that success and comfort never could. An empath feels these moments more intensely than most. Where others may quickly move on from disappointment, the empath tends to examine it from every angle. They replay conversations. They search for meaning. They wonder what they could have done differently. Sometimes this reflection becomes wisdom. Other times it becomes self-blame. Understanding the difference changes everything. Psychologically, empaths are often highly attuned to emotional signals. Their brains naturally scan for shifts in mood, tension, and hidden feelings. This ability creates profound connection, but it also creates vulnerability. When something goes wrong, they don't simply observe conflict, they absorb it. They internalize emotions that were never theirs to carry. Imagine walking through life with every emotional volume turned to its highest setting. Joy feels magnificent, love feels limitless, but disappointment becomes devastating. Rejection feels deeply personal. Betrayal echoes long after everyone else has forgotten it happened. This heightened sensitivity is not weakness. It is simply intensity without sufficient protection. Many empaths spend years believing that love means endurance. If someone is hurting, they stay. If someone disappoints them, they understand. If someone repeatedly crosses boundaries, they explain away the behavior because they can see the pain behind it. Compassion becomes confusion. They begin confusing understanding someone with accepting everything they do. There is an important philosophical distinction here. Understanding explains behavior. It does not excuse it. You can understand why someone became emotionally unavailable without sacrificing your own emotional needs. You can understand someone's childhood wounds without allowing them to create wounds in you. Wisdom begins when empathy is balanced by discernment. Every painful experience is teaching something, but only if we are willing to learn the correct lesson. The wrong lesson says, I should become colder so no one can hurt me again. The right lesson says, I can remain kind while becoming wiser. Those are two entirely different paths. One builds walls, the other builds strength. There is a misconception that healing means returning to the person you were before life hurt you. But real healing rarely works that way. You do not become who you were, you become someone new. Someone who still possesses compassion but no longer confuses self-sacrifice with love. Someone who still believes in people, but also believes in boundaries. Someone who still forgives without repeatedly volunteering for the same pain. Think about the strongest trees in nature. They do not become resilient because they were protected from every storm. They become resilient because their roots learned how to grow deeper each time the wind challenged them. Human beings are no different. Every disappointment asks you to deepen your roots. Every betrayal asks you to clarify your values. Every rejection asks you to discover whether your identity depends on someone else's acceptance. This is why adversity, although deeply uncomfortable, often becomes the birthplace of authentic confidence. Not the loud confidence that seeks applause, the quiet confidence that no longer depends on it. Many empaths spend years searching for validation because they naturally measure themselves through the well-being of others. If everyone around them is happy, they feel successful. If someone is upset, they assume responsibility. This creates an impossible emotional contract. Your self-worth becomes dependent on variables you cannot control. Eventually, life interrupts that illusion. Someone leaves despite everything you gave. Someone misunderstands your intentions. Someone chooses convenience over loyalty. And in those painful moments, you are confronted with a question that changes the course of your life. Who are you when your kindness is not appreciated? That question has no easy answer, but it has a liberating one. You are still valuable, you are still enough. Your worth was never determined by another person's ability to recognize it. This realization is not merely comforting, it is transformational. Because once you stop measuring your value through external approval, your energy changes. You stop performing goodness in hopes of receiving love in return. Instead, you express kindness because it reflects who you are, not because it guarantees how others will respond. That shift marks the beginning of emotional freedom. It also marks the beginning of your comeback. The comeback is not about erasing your past. It is about reclaiming its meaning. The betrayals no longer define you, they educate you. The failures no longer shame you, they refine you. The heartbreak no longer imprisons you, it expands your capacity to choose differently. Your scars stop becoming evidence of weakness. They become evidence that you survived experiences that could have convinced you to stop believing in people altogether, and yet you still choose hope, only now with wisdom standing beside it. That is a remarkable transformation, because the strongest empath is not the one who never gets hurt. The strongest empath is the one who learns that sensitivity is most powerful when guided by self-respect. If your past has been painful, don't ask only, "Why did this happen to me?" Ask the more powerful question, "Who has this experience prepared me to become?" The answer to that question may be the beginning of the greatest comeback of your life. If your pain has been preparing you rather than punishing you, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What do you do with everything those experiences have taught you? Knowledge that never changes behavior remains information, not transformation. And for many empaths, the greatest transformation begins with a decision that initially feels uncomfortable, even unnatural. It is the decision to stop chasing approval. This is where many people misunderstand empathy. They assume that because someone is deeply compassionate, they must also be endlessly available. They confuse generosity with accessibility. They believe that the more an empath gives, the more fulfilled they will become. Yet, the opposite is often true. An empath who gives without limits eventually reaches a point where they no longer recognize themselves. They wake up exhausted, not because life is difficult, but because they have spent so much time responding to everyone else's emotional needs that they have forgotten how to hear their own. Their calendar is full, their mind is crowded, and their heart is carrying burdens that were never theirs to begin with. This does not happen overnight. It happens one small compromise at a time. You say yes when you want to say no. You apologize for expressing a need. You explain yourself repeatedly because you hope to avoid disappointing someone. You ignore your intuition because another person's comfort seems more important than your own clarity. None of these moments seem significant by themselves, but over time they accumulate into a life where your identity becomes organized around other people's expectations rather than your own values. Psychology offers an important insight here. Human beings naturally seek belonging. We are social creatures. From childhood, we learn that acceptance often depends on adapting to the people around us. This instinct is healthy to a point. It allows communities to exist, but there is a subtle difference between adaptation and abandonment. Adaptation allows you to cooperate without losing yourself. Self-abandonment asks you to disappear in order to be accepted. Many empaths have spent years practicing the second without realizing it. They become experts at reading rooms, anticipating reactions, avoiding conflict, and creating emotional harmony. These abilities are impressive. They make them wonderful friends, thoughtful partners, dependable colleagues. But beneath these strengths often lies an invisible fear. What happens if I stop being everything everyone expects me to be? That fear deserves attention because it reveals something deeper than people pleasing. It reveals an attachment to external validation. Somewhere along the way, approval became connected to safety. If everyone is happy with me, then I belong. If everyone approves of me, then I am worthy. But approval is one of the least stable foundations on which to build an identity. It changes with circumstances, it changes with opinions, it changes with expectations you cannot possibly satisfy forever. If your peace depends on universal approval, then your peace belongs to everyone except you. This is why boundaries become such a profound act of psychological maturity. Many people think boundaries are walls designed to keep others out. In reality, healthy boundaries are bridges. They tell people how to have a relationship with you without requiring either person to lose themselves. A boundary is not punishment, it is information. It simply says, "This is where I end and you begin." That sentence sounds simple. Living it is one of the most difficult emotional skills a person can develop, especially for empaths. Because saying no often feels like causing pain. Choosing yourself can feel like betraying someone else. Protecting your energy may even trigger guilt. But guilt is not always evidence that you are doing something wrong. Sometimes guilt is simply the emotional residue of abandoning an old pattern. Think about how many people have been conditioned to believe that love means constant availability. If someone calls, you answer. If someone needs you, you sacrifice. If someone is disappointed, you immediately search for a way to fix it. Eventually, you become indispensable to everyone except yourself. And there is an irony here. People often admire your generosity while remaining unaware of its cost. You become known as the reliable one, the understanding one, the patient one, the one who can always handle a little more. Until one day you cannot, not because you have become weak, but because even the strongest emotional system cannot function indefinitely without restoration. Nature teaches this beautifully. Every season has periods of growth and periods of rest. The heart itself functions through rhythm, contraction, and expansion. Breathing depends equally on inhaling and exhaling. Everything healthy alternates between giving and receiving. Only human beings sometimes imagine that endless giving is sustainable. It isn't. Relationships also suffer when one person consistently overfunctions. If you constantly rescue others from the consequences of their choices, they lose opportunities to grow. If you always regulate another person's emotions, they never learn emotional responsibility. What feels like compassion can quietly become control, and what looks like love can unintentionally prevent another person's development. Real love respects another person's capacity to carry their own life. It does not constantly carry it for them. This is why protecting your peace is not selfish. It is responsible, because a peaceful person contributes something very different to the world than an exhausted one. When you are emotionally grounded, your kindness becomes intentional instead of compulsive. Your generosity becomes a choice instead of an obligation. Your compassion becomes sustainable instead of draining. People notice something has changed. Some will celebrate it. Others will resist it. This is important to understand. The people who benefited from your lack of boundaries may not immediately appreciate your new ones. Not because your boundaries are wrong, but because every relationship unconsciously develops rules. If someone has always had unlimited access to your time, your attention, and your emotional energy, they may interpret your new limits as rejection. In reality, you are not rejecting them. You are rejecting a pattern that was slowly disconnecting you from yourself. There is an essential philosophical principle at work here. Every meaningful relationship requires two whole individuals. Not one person constantly disappearing so another can remain comfortable. Love without self-respect eventually becomes resentment. Generosity without limits becomes exhaustion. Empathy without boundaries becomes self-neglect. The comeback begins the moment you recognize these truths, not intellectually, but emotionally. It begins when you trust your intuition before seeking permission. When you stop explaining every decision that protects your peace. When silence no longer frightens you. When disappointing someone occasionally feels less painful than disappointing yourself every day. That is not selfishness, that is emotional adulthood, because the strongest version of an empath is not the one who carries everyone else's emotional world. It is the one who has finally learned to carry their own with dignity. And something extraordinary happens when you stop chasing approval. You stop shrinking, you stop apologizing for existing, you stop measuring your worth by how indispensable you are. Instead, you begin living from a place of authenticity rather than performance. People experience your presence differently, not because you have become colder, but because your warmth now comes from abundance instead of depletion. That is the kind of energy that inspires trust. That is the kind of strength that attracts healthier relationships. Once you have stopped allowing your past to define your future, and once you have learned that protecting your peace is not an act of selfishness but an act of self-respect, something remarkable begins to happen. You no longer see life as a series of events happening to you. Instead, you begin to see yourself as someone capable of shaping what comes next. And that shift is where every true comeback begins. Many people imagine a comeback as a dramatic moment. They picture an overnight transformation, a sudden breakthrough, a day when confidence arrives all at once and every doubt disappears. We are drawn to stories of instant success because they are emotionally satisfying. They suggest that change happens in a single decision. Real life rarely works that way. The most meaningful transformations are almost invisible while they are happening. They are built in quiet moments that no one applauds. They begin with conversations you have with yourself when no one else is listening. They begin the morning you decide to get out of bed despite disappointment. They begin when you choose honesty instead of avoidance, responsibility instead of blame, courage instead of certainty. The comeback is rarely loud, it is disciplined. This matters because confidence is one of the most misunderstood qualities in modern culture. We often think of confidence as something people either possess or lack. We assume it is a personality trait, almost like eye color, something assigned rather than developed. But psychology tells us something very different. Confidence is not the cause of action. More often, it is the result of action. You do not become confident and then begin living differently. You begin living differently, and confidence quietly follows. Every promise you keep to yourself becomes evidence that you are trustworthy. Every difficult conversation you avoid postponing strengthens your sense of integrity. Every boundary you maintain reinforces the belief that your needs matter. Confidence is accumulated proof. It is built through repeated experiences where your actions align with your values. This is especially important for empaths because so much of their attention has historically been directed outward. They have spent years understanding other people's motivations, encouraging other people's dreams, supporting other people's healing. Somewhere in the process, they postponed investing the same curiosity in themselves. Imagine asking yourself the questions you have spent years asking everyone else. What inspires me? What drains me? What kind of life actually reflects my values? What am I pretending not to know because the answer would require change? These questions are uncomfortable because they remove excuses. They invite responsibility. They ask you to become an active participant in your own life, rather than a passive observer waiting for circumstances to improve. Philosophers throughout history have returned to this idea repeatedly. Freedom is not merely the absence of external limitations. It is the willingness to accept responsibility for the choices that remain available to you, even after disappointment. Even after betrayal, even after failure, you may not control what happened yesterday, but you always participate in the meaning it carries tomorrow. That realization is profoundly empowering, because if meaning can change, then identity can change. Too many people introduce themselves through the language of their wounds. I've always been overlooked. I always attract the wrong people. I'm just too sensitive. These statements feel like observations. Over time, they become identities, and identities quietly shape behavior. If you believe you are destined to be overlooked, you begin expecting it. If you believe your sensitivity is a flaw, you start apologizing for it before anyone else has the chance to criticize you. The stories we repeatedly tell ourselves eventually become the architecture of our lives. This is why your comeback begins with changing the narrative, not denying the past, but refusing to let it become your permanent definition. Your experiences are chapters. They are not the title of the book. There is also another misconception worth challenging. Many people believe healing means becoming fearless. It does not. Fear is part of being human. Even emotionally healthy people experience uncertainty, rejection, and self-doubt. The difference is not the absence of fear, it is the willingness to continue despite it. Courage has never required certainty. It only requires movement. Think about every meaningful achievement in your life. Every relationship worth having required vulnerability. Every opportunity worth pursuing involved risk. Every important decision carried uncertainty. Waiting until you feel completely ready often becomes another way of remaining safely unchanged. Growth asks something different. It asks you to trust that clarity often follows commitment rather than preceding it. Empaths understand trust deeply when it comes to other people. Now the invitation is to develop that same trust in yourself. Trust that your intuition has matured. Trust that your boundaries can protect you. Trust that your previous experiences have increased your wisdom rather than diminished your potential. This is not blind optimism. It is earned confidence, because you are no longer the version of yourself who entered those painful situations years ago. You have learned, you have observed, you have changed. Yet many people continue judging themselves according to outdated versions of who they once were. Imagine wearing clothes that fit you 10 years ago and wondering why they now feel restrictive. We would immediately recognize that growth had occurred. But psychologically, we often continue wearing identities that no longer fit. The people pleaser, the rescuer, the one who always sacrifices. Perhaps those identities helped you survive. But survival and fulfillment are not the same thing. At some point, every comeback requires letting go of the person who kept you safe so that you can become the person who allows you to truly live. And living fully requires discipline, not dramatic discipline, quiet discipline, the discipline to protect your mornings from unnecessary distraction. The discipline to speak honestly when honesty feels uncomfortable. The discipline to rest before exhaustion becomes collapse. The discipline to choose relationships where respect is mutual rather than one-sided. Small decisions repeated consistently reshape entire lives. We often underestimate this because dramatic change captures attention. Consistency transforms character. Think of water flowing over stone. No single drop appears powerful, yet over time it changes landscapes. Human habits work in exactly the same way. The life you experience 5 years from now will likely be determined less by extraordinary moments than by ordinary choices repeated every day. That realization should not feel intimidating. It should feel liberating, because it means your future does not depend on one perfect opportunity. It depends on today's next decision. Perhaps your comeback begins by making one phone call you have been avoiding. Perhaps it begins by ending a relationship that has quietly diminished your spirit. Perhaps it begins by finally believing that your dreams deserve as much attention as everyone else's expectations. Whatever form it takes, understand this. Your comeback is not about proving your critics wrong. It is not about making the people who underestimated you regret their decisions. Those motivations eventually lose their energy. The deepest transformation happens when you are no longer driven by revenge but by alignment. When your life begins reflecting who you truly are instead of who you felt pressured to become. That is